I'd like you to introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about yourself.
My name is Shannon Lively. I moved to Toronto in 2016. I'm trained as a lawyer. I studied law in Alberta, but I came to Toronto to study art. And I'm trying to build my own studio practice at this time, develop my own body of work in portraiture and figurative art, but I also practice law. So in my legal practice, it's a freelance kind of nature of work. I do a lot of research and writing for a legal publisher here in Toronto. I also work part-time for a law firm back in Alberta, doing things like drafting their pleadings, writing their briefs, a lot of reading and writing in my work, and a lot of answering questions.
How did you find Aerosmith?
My therapist actually has done the part-time adult program at Aerosmith. She did it years ago. And I told her about some of the difficulties that I was having in my work. I was getting feedback that I was spending too much time, that my hours were too long. Sometimes I would kind of miss the point in my work. Like, it wasn't that the work was inaccurate, it just wasn't quite what our client would necessarily be looking for. And I was frustrated because I had been trying to resolve these issues myself. I knew that I'd had them for years. And she suggested to me that perhaps I had a learning dysfunction, and that if I did, that Aerosmith would be able to help.
What brought you to Aerosmith?
I didn't finish my undergraduate degree before I went to law school. I graduated on the dean's list in law school. It was a lot of work. It was very hard work, but in my mind, there is no way I could have a learning dysfunction. And knowing my issues with work, I thought, well, okay, I know what these issues are and I can deal with this myself, but they just kept coming back. And so the thing that brought me here was finally the realization that these issues probably were not going to go away unless I tried looking at things, looking at a different way to solve my problem. And so I decided to come here to do an assessment in April of this year.
You went through a learning profile assessment identifying your cognitive strengths and challenges. Tell me what you learned.
It was kind of like a reaffirmation, I suppose, of the difficulties that I knew that I had. I was surprised. One issue that I thought was going to come up did not come up. I came out as average with symbolic thinking. I had expected to have a dysfunction in that area. Instead, I had a dysfunction in symbol relations, which I think is related. I also discovered that I had issues in terms of nonverbal information, which shouldn't be a surprise, but it very much opened my eyes. It took a wee bit of the stigma out of some of the difficulties I've had over the years with regulating my emotions. To see that it was, a part of my brain that wasn't functioning as well made me feel better about it, made me feel like, oh, there's a reasonable explanation for this, instead of feeling badly about it, and also understanding, oh, there's something I can do about this. So it's, in a way, getting the assessment back was an affirmation of the concerns that I already knew that I had. And there were other areas as well, like difficulty with following instructions, to which I was like, oh, that makes sense for a number of assignments I've had where I've gone slightly off track.
What has your experience been as you worked through the cognitive intensive program this summer?
I feel like doing the program has affected my well-being in ways that I wouldn't have imagined, especially given that my dysfunction in symbol relations was mild. I started seeing changes, I think, within the first week. So I have to work part-time while I'm doing the program, or I had to at least that first weekend. And I was asked to draft some legal work. I had to do an affidavit. I had to work on a brief. And I found that I was having an easier time preparing my work than I would usually have. It actually felt fun. I was multitasking, transitioning from drafting the affidavit to reviewing a transcript to drafting the brief, and I was able to handle it all with a lot more ease than I felt I normally would. I didn't get stressed about it. I was able to finish it in a timely way. The client was happy with it. My employer was happy with it. And it just felt easier. So that was the first thing that I really started to pick up on. Then I also felt that I was having an easier time engaging with people, like particularly in my art studio space. It's in a art school, and there's a lot of fellow students, and I kind of would experiment with having a wee chat with people in the kitchen and found that that was a little bit easier. I found that I was able to be more articulate. I was able to talk about my feelings with people that I'm close to with greater clarity than usual. In a way, I felt a wee bit braver. Then going further into the program, I think about 3 weeks in, I began to notice a change in my artwork. I've been doing a lot of dry brush drawing just to change my brushwork in my art. And I started a simple drawing at the beginning of the program and kind of left it for 2 weeks because I got busy. And when I went back to it, I was able to work so much more efficiently than usual, and I felt like I was able to make my image look more realistic with less effort. It was as if you could feel it in space. I was actually gobsmacked when I realized that I had finished this in just 5 sessions, and that I was able to work with more clarity, I suppose, than I'm accustomed to, and with less feedback. Like I was able to see problems on my own and fix them on my own to my satisfaction, which was fantastic. That's always the goal, but it's not always something one achieves.
What would you want to say to people like you who are successful, though feel they're blocked in some way?
I would say be curious. Be curious about why there's a block. Instead of trying to compensate for it in other ways, which is what I've done, I think, since I graduated from law school, probably even while I was still in law school. If you have an opportunity to look into why you have a block, try to be curious. It's so hard, especially if you are successful. You might feel there's a bit of a stigma in admitting that something is wrong, or at least that's how I felt. And in fact, like my family thinks I'm a little crazy for having come to this program. But for me, like finally saying I'm curious and I want to change was fantastic.
What would you say to somebody who's thinking about enrolling in Aerosmith?
Do the full assessment, and to know that it could change your life. Like to know that it could change actually working on something that's a problem area can change your sense of well-being. And it's hard to explain it in a way to make people understand. I feel like I need to spend a lot more time thinking about my own experience. But in my mind, doing Aerosmith is going to change a lot of things for me going forward. I feel so much more self-confident. And I think people should know that it has capacity to change you.
What would you like people to know about neuroplasticity and cognitive change?
I would want them to know that a person's capacity can change. I feel like just in 6 weeks that I can see changes in me that I didn't even conceptualize as being possible, that I didn't even know I would benefit from having changed. So neuroplasticity, I feel like it's such a powerful tool. I was a little bit skeptical about neuroplasticity, but it's so exciting to be able to experience change in something that you didn't know was possible.
What would you say to someone to let them know that it actually is your brain that has changed?
I just feel a lot more capable. I feel like I understand the world in a different way than I did before I started the program. I knew there was a change as soon as I started doing my legal work, and I was able to work with ease because that just was not the case previously. I was working on a ridiculous deadline where I had to draft an affidavit and a brief in a 2-day period, but I was able to handle it with a lot more grace. Like, I felt different when I was doing the work. And in fact, I was asked to do other work maybe in the third week of the program. Again, rush deadline. Can you drop everything and do this? And I did it without panicking. I did it without going overboard in my research, which is something that has been a historic problem for me. I just felt like I could handle it. But it wasn't even thinking that I could handle it. Like, it was intuitive in a way. Like, oh, that's enough research. I can stop there. Now's the time to work on this piece of the letter. It feels intuitive. Like, it feels like it's a part of you. It's not something that you have to actively think about. You just function differently. When I was painting and doing the dry brush drawing, like, I swear I did the piece in half the time that it would have taken me before, which just feels ridiculous because I hadn't been spending any extra time in my studio. I hadn't been spending any time painting. And yet I could see this change that I don't think I could account for in any other way than having done the cognitive intensive. It's as if you're able to discount superfluous information before that might have clouded an issue. Or you can, like when I was painting, I was able to say, oh, this is an issue, this form isn't turning, and I was able to tackle it in a much more efficient way, which is why I think I was able to end up with something that I enjoyed so much faster. Same with my legal work. It was as if I wasn't distracted by things that might have taken my attention away in unnecessary directions before. And I have to say, the other thing that makes me feel certain that this is a change in my brain is this unexplainable feeling of confidence that I've suddenly derived. Like, all of a sudden I feel like I've got a vision for my work that just hadn't been there. It's just unreal. I'm so happy.
How do you think this work should go forward? How should it go out into the world?
I wish that it was available to people at a younger age. I'm 34. I'm turning 35 in a month and a day. And I feel like, in a way, I have a new lease on life because of it. But it's also a shame that I've gone this long without it. So I wish that it was available to children in schools. I wish that it was available, I guess, to a broad range of students, because I feel like I might not have been flagged as a young child as necessarily having a learning dysfunction because I always excelled academically. Although, if I think back to the nonverbal information piece, I think that we would have been able to identify that as being a dysfunction probably very early on. I just feel like an adult's quality of life could be improved if this was something that was targeted at a younger age. I grew up in northern Alberta where our educational opportunities were somewhat limited. And I wonder how many kids up there would have benefited from something like this. Like, how many lives could have changed?
How do you know that your transformation is not just attributable to psychotherapy?
There wasn't anything that happened in my therapy to trigger this kind of reaction. 3 weeks in May, I think we spent all of our sessions talking about whether or not I should do this program and the benefits and the potential costs of doing the program. My therapist very much wanted me to look into this. We took the whole month of June off because she was concerned that once I started the intensive, that it would trigger things and that I would need therapeutic support at that time, which I thought was kind of ridiculous. I didn't have any idea what this program would do in terms of causing me to think back on the past. In my classroom, Andrea had mentioned how some people will start to think about their lives differently, will start to put things into context, will start to understand events differently than they had before. A year and a half of therapy all of a sudden has come into focus. And I don't think it's because of anything that my therapist necessarily said. It's just because doing the clocks, I'm able to understand things differently. I'm able to see my patterns. And that's something that your therapist can't do for you. She can't make you see it. I mean, she can point it out in ways, but it's not the same as understanding it for yourself and being able to say, oh, I want to change my behavior. In our last session, it sure felt like we were able to make a whole bunch of progress, where we got to the point of talking about issues that I very seldom am able to get to. She hasn't had to talk to me, at least during these last few sessions, about trying to rein me back into being on point. She hasn't told me I've gone off point. I've had very vivid dreams, very interesting dreams since I started. Not necessarily all happy dreams, but things that have made me want to delve into my past and into my childhood more. Since doing this cognitive intensive, I've realized that there's issues there that I have to go back and explore, that there are things that I either didn't want to look at before or didn't understand. Actually, I think a lot of it was simply not understanding, not even understanding the kind of questions that I should have been asking in our family dynamic, questions that probably wouldn't have occurred to me, where now I feel suddenly like I want to know more about my family.
What is your vision for this work?
I'd love to see it in public schools, or I guess just not necessarily only in the context of a specialized school like Aerosmith, although it's amazing that students can come here. But, you know, again, coming from Northern Alberta, I think that there's a lot of people there who would benefit from this kind of work, but simply don't have the funds to send their children to Toronto for a year or two to ameliorate dysfunctions. So to have it in a broader context, to have it conceptualized as part of a school curriculum or something that's even available in schools, I think that would be a very powerful thing.